Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Learn the Keys to a More Predictable Time to Market. I'm your host, Paul Dvorak, founding editor of Medical Design and Outsourcing magazine. Thank you for joining us. Now, before we begin, let me cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, you'll see several application widgets. For instance, when a question occurs to you during the presentation, click on the Q&A widget. Type in your question there. Now, I encourage you to ask questions. Don't wait till the end of the presentation. Submit your questions as they occur to you. And we capture all the questions, and we'll try to answer as many as possible before our time is up. Should a question deserve a fuller answer or we've run out of time, it'll be answered by email. In the resource widget, the one that looks like a green folder, you'll find a copy of today's slide deck and additional materials. This webcast is presented using a slide deck and not a screen share or live demo. For your viewing comfort, you can expand the slide area by clicking on the Maximize icon at the top right or by dragging the bottom right corner. If you have technical difficulty, click on the Help widget, the one with the question mark. And lastly, if you don't see slide movement in your console, hit the refresh icon on your browser bar or hit the F5 key to refresh. An on-demand version of this webcast should be available tomorrow and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Now let me tell you a little about our speaker, Michael Lynch. He's a seasoned medical device product development professional with more than 30 years experience spanning a range of products, including high-volume disposable drug delivery systems, orthopedic implants, and electromechanical capital equipment. He has managed the product development process from concept through full-scale manufacturing. He's also a co-inventor on 5 U.S. patents and is recognized within the industry for his technical competence and ability to identify issues during design reviews. And with that, let us begin. Michael, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it. So welcome to the webinar today. I want to spend a little bit of time giving you some helpful hints and guidance on how to hit those timelines that your management wants you to hit when you're developing new products. So from an overview point of view, we're going to cover development issues that impact time to market and product quality. We're going to spend some time talking about requirements, regulations, how to manage resources effectively, how to implement new technology and not have it derail your program, the keys to verification and validation activities that assure that you're going to deliver the correct product to the market, and then what to do with your regulatory submissions so that you're not held up once you make that submission. In terms of how the program will flow, I'm going to spend a little bit of time defining what's the problem, what are the issues that we face in the medical device world. Spend a little bit of time about what are the causes, the major causes, give you my insight into what are the best practices and solutions for solving those, and then of course we'll have some time at the end that allows us to take your questions and hopefully give you the answers that you need. So what is the problem? So when a company misses their market launch, it costs a lot of money. There's sales that are not achieved on the desired timeline. Often the miss is due to development that was incomplete or done wrong, and so additional development expense is incurred. And then there's also lost opportunities, first to market and other things that are a little bit less tangible. So if you're delayed to market, what is that impact? Well, first to market with a new medical device usually means that you'll establish dominant market share and you'll get the lion's share of revenue, at least for the first few years of that product. You also increase your brand equity because you're known as an innovator. People like to be affiliated with innovators. And as you increase that brand equity, of course, your stocks and other things can improve, but it also puts you into the forefront of people's minds when they're thinking about other products to buy. And if you have a portfolio of products, what you'll realize is pull-through of your other products by having that one new product being first to market. Now let's say you're an early stage startup and first to market is a long way off. But what you're trying to achieve is going to be first in human. So what's the impact of being the first in human? Well, in a lot of cases, that gets you additional access to capital. So if you're a startup, you're going to be struggling with how much money you have in the coffers. But once you get first in human, the people start to line up to give you the money. You also build that brand awareness, much like if you're already entering the market with your brand equity. And that brand awareness helps you do a lot of different things. It gets people willing to collaborate with you. It gets you a foot in the door with the FDA and regulatory agencies. And so there's a lot of benefit to being either first to market or first in human. Now, what does a delayed launch mean? Well, if you're late to market and somebody's already there, it means you're going to have a hard battle for a much smaller slice of the pie. Your market share is going to be hard fought and won't be what it could have been if you'd been first to market. You also won't realize the additional brand identity or brand equity won't be built as much because you'll be second to market. You'll be the Me Too guy. Of course, the revenue is going to be less than what you planned for because it's a smaller market share than what you had anticipated. And there may be, of course, the added development expense, which would have been more than what you planned for because you're delayed. And when you put that all together, now your return on investment is less than what you planned. Now, of course, there is a worst case situation that can occur. If your competitor gets to market first and they bring a poor performing, poor quality, or the product is not well supported or accepted in the market, they could poison the market. Whereas if you were first to market, you would have grown that market. But often case, if you're second to market and the market's been poisoned, it is a really steep uphill battle to even sell a product. So product quality, or a lack thereof, can result in recalls, lawsuits, lost market share, and damage to brand equity. Product quality can affect the product development process at the beginning, in the middle, at the end, after you launch, even after you've been in the market for a long time. There are many things that can affect that. But in most cases, if you get to the end of your product development program and you have issues with product quality, you're going to be delayed to market. So if we look at product failures and recalls, what is the impact? Well, the FDA put together a report in 2011 called Understanding Barriers to Medical Device Quality. And they noted that over the prior 7 years, the adverse events increased an average of 15% per year. So these are the reported adverse events that go into the MAUDE database. Similarly, recalls during that time period increased an average of 6% per year. So they clearly identified that the quality of products relative to the user needs and the demand had shifted. And part of this was just changes in technology, but also as people were driving so hard to get first to market, sometimes corners were cut and the product quality wasn't there. Similar to the FDA, the McKinsey Center for Government published a report in 2013 talking about the business case for medical device quality. And what they highlighted is non-routine quality events cost our industry between $2.5 and $5 billion per year. If you take the industry as a whole, that's an average of 2 to 4% of revenue that's basically a non-value added cost because we didn't do things right the first time. To put that into further perspective, the Obama medical excise tax, Obamacare tax, is 2.3%. But if we look at our cost of not doing it right the first time, it's equal to or greater than that. So what's the cause of delayed to market and poor product quality? Well, most missed market launches are due to failure to plan at a level of detail that assures that you understand everything that has to happen and that you're able to follow that plan and execute on that plan. Many times project plans are only done at top level or major milestones, and they miss the details that make up the bulk of the work. So it's hard to use that plan to make an accurate estimate of how many people do I need, how long is it going to take them to get that work done, what are the contingencies I should have in place. Project plans also might not include all the tasks required to place the product into a given market. So if you don't understand the requirements for placing the product into Europe or into China, you might not include that in your project plan, and at the end of the day, you've grossly underestimated how much labor and how long it's going to take to complete those tasks and get that product ready for market. Regulatory requirements for target markets may be missed at the start of a program and the work is not planned. In addition, what they have today as regulatory requirements may change over time. So if you have a 3-year development program, you need to be constantly aware of what's going on and adjust your plan accordingly. And then, of course, product requirements ideally would be user-driven. What's the user need? What unmet clinical need are we trying to deliver with this product? Well, on occasion, people discover a new technology or find a new way to do something, and they become technology-driven, and they miss the idea of what is the user need, and then they fail during validation. They're not meeting the user needs, and they're not able to deliver a product that the user wants. So that's a failure to plan, and one of the major issues for market launch delays. Another major reason is resource allocation. So oftentimes you'll have too few resources for the amount of work required to meet the project target. And a lot of people say, oh, figure out how to get it done. Just use what you have available. Easier said than done. And so if you don't have the resources, things are going to drag behind. Incorrect skill sets for the work required is another issue. So you may have the correct number of resources, but if those resources don't have the skills that you think they do, or maybe they don't have the skills that their predecessors had, then you're going to make slower progress, and in some cases you might need to repeat tasks due to failure to execute. So resource allocation is a key cause for delayed market. The other one that we see quite often is new technology implementation. People want to implement a new technology. In some cases, it may be a technology that's new to them. In other cases, it's a technology that's new to everybody. And placing that technology development on the critical path for a new product really raises the bar in terms of the amount of risk that you have. Additional causes for delays include late-stage failures. And what I mean by this is I call it the swinging for the fence verification strategy. And this is where you don't do enough upfront testing and you anticipate or believe your design is going to be great. And then you delay your performance testing until you get to design transfer. And maybe you don't have sufficient design reviews or development testing to really know whether it's going to pass or fail. And so you're swinging for the fence. And then a lot of times we see people fail. Intertek is a company that does a great deal of verification testing, and we see a lot of clients not make it over the fence when they're swinging for it. I like to make the analogy, Babe Ruth was the home run king, but he was also one of the strikeout kings. Another aspect that comes up in late stage is last-minute usability testing. That's a failure to consider the human factors and usability of the device early in the design. So you get to market with what you think is the great design, and then you find out that there are issues having to do with usability. Use errors haven't been mitigated, and they lead to either unsafe or high-risk devices, and it's unacceptable to the market. And lastly, you've got it ready to go. You've got all your verification testing done. You think you're ready to submit, and then you put everything together, and you find out, oh, I don't have all of the requirements met. Between the time I started this program and when I'm ready to submit, there are new requirements that I hadn't anticipated and I hadn't kept track of, and so my project didn't put them in to do those tasks. And now I'm behind the 8 ball because I've got a bunch of additional work in order to make that submission. So an example would be that in the EU, they just launched the new medical device regulation. There are new requirements there that are going to make your technical file have more content than it had in the past. And if you modeled the technical file that you will deliver in 3 years on what you delivered last year, it won't be good enough. So your regulatory agencies are continually raising the bar. So in terms of product quality, what are the mistakes? Well, the 2011 FDA report cited the following causes for recalls: hardware, software, labeling, packaging, process, many different things. And who was responsible for those issues? Well, design certainly was responsible for a lot of those recalls where product wasn't done properly first. Suppliers, surprisingly, were responsible for a lot of them. And you'll see today that supplier controls are a key aspect of your quality management system that you should be implementing. Manufacturing, your own manufacturing processes sometimes are reasons for recall when things aren't done right. And post-production and change control is another area where you make changes but you don't validate them and you anticipate that they're going to work and they don't. So that study found that 31% of recalls could be attributed to failure in product design. Of that 31%, 15% of the recalls were due to defective hardware and 8% were due to issues with software. So why are the mistakes made with product quality? Well, similar to time to market issues, it's usually resources. You have too few people trying to do too much. You can also have inexperienced resources. Some young engineers can't even imagine what can go wrong with a product. Because we learn more from our failure than success, and if you haven't experienced a lot of failures, you can't anticipate all the things that can go wrong. Also, with regard to resources, if we have incorrect skill sets doing the work, it won't be optimum. If you have an electrical engineer doing mechanical design, it may be acceptable, but it might not be optimum. The other place with regard to resources we run into issues is when there's no technical oversight. So technical oversight means somebody that's been there and done that before. Someone that's made the mistakes, has learned from the trial and error, hopefully doesn't make the same mistakes twice, but has that ability to take a design apart and give feedback to the team to let them know where their potential pitfalls and problems lie. So sometimes experienced technical people are gone from the organization, whether they're retired or moved on, you don't know, but if they're not available, they're not available. But on occasion, you have experienced technical people, but they're deployed on highly critical programs or doing something, firefighting, and they're just not available as a resource. And that ends up causing problems because the review, the critical review that should be taking place on the product development side doesn't take place. And so you're just stuck with what your team, who may be inexperienced, is able to achieve. The other area where we run into problems is new technology. And similar to a lack of experience, because that technology is new, we haven't seen the failures before. Similarly, because it's new technology, there aren't electrical safety standards or requirements in place that are best practices and known within the industry. So the risks aren't well documented, they're also not well understood, and there aren't test methods to assure that the safety of that new technology is achieved. Within organizations, there's also a reluctance to test a new technology to failure. In some cases, it may be that the technology to take to failure is very expensive. In other cases, it might be that you just test to what the requirements were, but you don't know how much safety factor you have. Implementation of new technology is often based on the product development timeline, meaning we have a goal, we need to launch this product in 24 months, and not necessarily when is that technology going to be ready to be implemented into the new product. And that can lead to shortcuts and not vetting the technology adequately. So some other reasons that common product development mistakes are made: incomplete user needs. If you don't understand what your user needs, how can you deliver exactly what he wants? Also, an incorrect translation of user needs into product specifications. So your user need is the voice of the customer, and you need to turn that into some engineering specifications that you can measure and verify performance against. But if you don't do that accurately, you might either have a measurement that can't be done, or it's subjective, or you might have a measurement where you've set the bar too low relative to what the user need is. And so that translation activity is critical for success. Failure to apply risk management is another major issue that results in poor product quality. Risk management processes, specifically risk analysis, hazard analysis, failure mode effects analysis, fault tree analysis, all those tools that make up your risk management process should start the day you start to say, what are the user needs and how can this go wrong? From a clinical perspective, and then as you drive out through the design, make sure that you're looking at it very critically in terms of what are the risks, the hazards to patients, the hazards to the users, how do I get this product to market without any undue risk. If you do that, many times you can have a more innovative product into the market and not only a risk-free product. So failure to objectively review the design is another area where people fail to achieve and have product quality issues. As I mentioned previously, if you don't have the expertise in order to provide that objective review, you can have problems. But I like to also tell engineers that a design is not your baby. You'll love your baby even when they're ugly. But a design should not be your baby. It should be someone you want to date. You got to be critical and get someone else to review it. Failure to evaluate the design against objective evidence during verification and validation is a place where we see many people fall down. They use subjective evidence, or they'll use limited sample sizes with people's viewpoints taken in, and it becomes anecdotal evidence and not truly objective evidence. And it leads them down a path where they're overconfident in the performance of the design and they don't recognize the issues until they actually launch the product. As I mentioned, failure to test or inspect to an adequate sample size during validation or verification can lead you down a path. Sometimes you're lucky when you really want to have proof that it's a good product. And failure to identify critical manufacturing processes and apply those controls. As I mentioned earlier, when you get through verification and validation, that should include process validation. And you should know that if there's something critical to the performance of the device or the risk of the device, and it can be adulterated in the manufacturing process, that you have to apply appropriate controls to assure that the quality of the device is maintained by the manufacturing process. And of course, a failure to manage your design or manufacturing process controls can also lead to problems of quality in the market. So if your manufacturing engineer makes a decision that he thinks he can save some money and time by altering a process and then doesn't do a process risk analysis to determine what could go wrong with that new or modified process, and if he doesn't validate that process and just implements that change, you could have product going out the door that, number one, is adulterated based on your regulatory submission, but number two, could create new hazards that weren't in the original design or was recognized in the design but had process controls. So you really have to manage both your design and manufacturing changes to assure that you don't introduce problems. So what's the solution? Well, there are numerous strategies and tactics for on-time and quality product development. I'm going to run down through a list here and then we'll go into them in much more detail. But you really need to make sure that you have comprehensive requirements definition. And I mean comprehensive. It's got to go soup to nuts, every different aspect of the product and through its entire life cycle. That includes how are you going to recycle it, what do you do at end of life, things of that nature. They have to be just really comprehensive. I see people limit themselves to just thinking about the person that touches it during the clinical use, but you really need to consider that entire product life cycle. Then you have to have rigorous project management. As we spoke, a failure to plan accordingly can result in a project plan that isn't realistic or can't be achieved, or if it is achieved, there's a lot of missing things at the end. You also have to have realistic resource allocation. We'll talk about some of the keys to that. You have to manage your technical risk, and ideally, you limit the technical risk that's in your product development programs, but I know that's not always a reality, and we'll cover that as well. Then you need to optimize your verification and validation, and that's because you don't have unlimited time and money, and so you want to make sure that you're doing it in the most effective manner. And then you need to make sure that you have compliant regulatory submissions. The worst thing is to get everything bundled up, you breathe a sigh of relief, you get ready to submit it, and then it's kicked back because it's incomplete or it's non-compliant. So let's talk about regulatory requirements. So you want to go a lot of different markets with this product, and you have to know what does it take to get into that market. And so we call this global market access research. So you want to define the current market entry requirements for the U.S., maybe the EU, China, Japan. What's it take there? And there's more to it than just technical specifications. There's how do you register the product? What's that sequence of events? How does it take place? What information has to be provided? What are the costs associated with that? You have to understand electrical safety requirements. What do I need to do in order to sell my product into that country? Are they harmonized with the whole world, or do they have unique requirements? So many of our medical devices today have wireless in them, and you have to understand that similar to the U.S. where we have the FCC, many countries have different wireless and radio requirements, whether it's the frequency you can operate at, what band, what power, and so you have to understand those requirements so that you can select and design the product so it's compliant with each of those countries. And then more and more we're seeing environmental requirements having to do with hazardous materials and recycling, and not just Europe anymore, but we're seeing countries in Asia such as Taiwan and Japan implement regulations along those lines. The other thing that is key is to identify regulatory trends and pending changes. I mentioned earlier the medical device regulation, but similar to that, you have the standards bodies are constantly updating and revising standards. And it might be that they go 5 or 6 years that they're not changed, but if you're at the end of a change cycle, you could anticipate that a new standard might come out before you actually launch your product, and then you might have a short window in which to make changes and become compliant. So you do need to identify those regulatory trends and make sure you stay on top of them. Product requirements are the other area where you need to have a complete understanding. And the best thing you can do to generate excellent product requirements is use some of these best practices for defining the requirements. Make sure you're acquiring the voice of customer. Listen to what the customer says. Do observational activities to understand what he doesn't say but what he does with his body. Evaluate a product in terms of the usability experience of the customer. Watch him use existing products. Watch him use your competitive products and understand what that could drive in terms of new user needs. Apply human factors engineering. How do people use the product? What do they do with the product? Are they misusing the product? That's a tool that will get you excellent product requirements if you use it early. And then, of course, translate those user needs into design input, into the specification. And there are some excellent tools to do this. Quality function deployment is a tool used by the Japanese auto industry to make best-in-class products over and over. It is not a no-brainer tool, but it is an excellent tool if used even for what they call the house of quality to get those user needs translated into those design inputs or specifications. And then consider specification development. Your specification should be in engineering measures, and you have to say, how am I going to measure it? How am I going to test it? How am I going to verify that that specification I set is achieved. Look at standards. You have to assess whether or not a given standard is applicable to your product. And there are more and more standards coming out every year that cover a wider variety of products. And you have to, in some cases, say, is that standard applicable? Even if it's not applicable, you have to figure out maybe there are some clauses within the standard that are applicable and that I've got to adhere to in order to sell the product into a given market. And lastly, look at the intellectual property around your product or similar products. This is going to tell you what requirements or design solutions may be available and may not be available, and it may drive you to set new product requirements that are different than what you would have done if you hadn't checked to see where the intellectual property landmine field exists. So if you don't have the skills or the people to do this inside, bring in external resources. You can get people to help guide you, assist, or train your team, but you can go about it blindly, but it's always going to be more effective and you'll stay closer to your timeline if you have somebody that can tell you when it's done right or when it's done wrong. So let's talk a little bit about project management. One of my favorite sayings is, fail to plan, plan to fail. And this has never been more true than in today's development environment. Things move so fast. Technology changes so fast. It's hard to keep up. And if you don't anticipate and lay things into your plan, you'll be surprised throughout the product development process. So start your planning as soon as you intend to acquire voice of customer. When you say, okay, I think I'm going to start working on this product development program and let's have marketing start to talk to the customers. Start laying out that whole planning activity in terms of what do I have to do to get voice of customer, when am I going to translate it into user needs, what's it going to mean in terms of product development. So this is all information that will help you determine whether or not it's going to be feasible to develop the product in the timeline you need to make first to market or not. And your planning can be concurrent with all those activities. While you're gathering user needs and translating those into the design input, you should be working that plan over and over because that information that's coming in from your marketing folks or from your engineers that are translating those user needs into design input is going to have a huge impact on what tasks are required for design and how much time you're going to need to do it. Project plans are living tools. They grow, they change, they evolve. And they're a tool that gives you the ability to communicate to your team so everybody's on the same page. They're all working in the same task priority. And it also is a tool to management. When you summarize it, they can see what your progress is, and then they can understand what's required to get it done. One of the issues that you have when you have a very top-level management tool like a project plan that's only just milestones is management looks at it and says, there's not much to do there. We can get that done much faster. When you lay out the plan at a level of detail that all of the tasks are called out, then when they start to say, what can we do to go faster, you can walk them through the plan and say, well, everything that you need in order to go faster requires either more money, more people, or higher risk. And so that detailed plan becomes a tool for you to manage your management so that you agree what's a reasonable date for product launch. Project plans, I believe, should be updated weekly. One of my guidances there is that if you go 2 or 3 weeks out and discover you're late on a critical path task, you're definitely losing those 2 to 3 weeks. There's no time to be made up. However, if you do it within a week and you say, okay, I'm late on this task, then you can be proactive and see what you can do to ensure that you only lose 1 week and that you don't end up losing 2 or 3 weeks. Likewise, you need to allocate the resources to manage the project plan. So, from my perspective, a team member is best. They have the technical understanding of the product. They have the relationship with the people. Ideally, it's your technical lead. But oftentimes, a project is so large that he can't both be the technical lead and also a project management planner. And so that's a case where you might have to bring in a certified project management planner or you have somebody within your organization, if you have dedicated resources that do that, they get on as part of the team. But it's great when you have somebody that has understanding of the product because they don't have to explain everything twice. When you're developing your plan, use historical records if you have them available to make initial estimates for durations and how much labor is going to be required. Ideally, as you're going through product development, you're building a catalog of older projects, and you can look at that and say, okay, we originally thought it was going to be 18 months, but it really took us 22. Is this something we should anticipate on the new project? And so you could use those old projects as a rule of thumb to get you started. How much granularity should you have in a project plan? As I mentioned before, a weekly update is good. And so I use what I call the 1% rule. So if you've got a project that's 24 months long, basically 100 weeks, 1% is going to be a 1-week task duration. So ideally, you would break that project down into 1-week durations. If you have good historical records, maybe you can work at a grosser level where you're working on 2, 4, 6-week long tasks, and maybe they're far down the road in the future, 6, 7 months down the road in the future, and maybe for the next 6 months, everything's scheduled out with a week-long task, but then as you go, you have a rolling activity where you improve the granularity of your project so you know that you're staying on track. So let's talk a little bit about resource skills and knowledge to ensure that you're successful. First and foremost, make sure you have the right people for the work. Do your resources have the right educational background? Do they have the right experience? Have they developed this type of product before? Do they understand what the product is and what the technology is? If not, when you're doing your plan, anticipate that you're going to have slower progress at the start as the resources learn about the product. So if you had a seasoned team and you might say, okay, to get through concept development is 10 weeks, well, that team of newbies might take you 12 or 14. So anticipate what your skill level is when you're doing your planning. Do you have access to subject matter experts who could provide guidance and oversight? They can provide a lot of help to the team, whether it's a chief engineer or somebody else in the organization that's maybe a little narrow and a subject matter expert that can look at the team and give them the guidance to say, don't go down that pathway, it's a dead end. If you do it this way, you'll have more success. And if you don't have those internal resources, do you have external resources to help you do those types of things? Also, from a resource point of view, do you have external resources identified for the things that you know you're going to do outside, such as safety testing, product certification, risk management, things of that nature? So, allocation of your resources. Make sure that the project has the right number of people on it in order to get all the work done that you've planned. And the question you have to ask, are the resources dedicated to the project or do they have other projects? If they have other projects, how do you prioritize their time? How does the organization prioritize their time? Are the resources from a shared service? So maybe you have a situation where all your design for electronic boards is done from a shared service. How are you going to get access to that shared service? Are there priorities set within the organization that you set at priority number 2 or number 10? You need to make sure you've got that into your project plan so that you don't make assumptions that end up biting you later. Also, when you're looking at your own resources, don't assume everybody's going to work 40 hours a week on your project. My guidance is about 70% for dedicated resources. They've got to still do their training, catch up with their emails, and service other things. Once again, as I mentioned, access to shared resources will depend on project priority. How is it done within your organization? Do you have alternative resources? So if you have a need to get a board designed, it's on critical path, but your internal resources are not going to be available. Do you have alternates where you can go outside the company, spend the necessary money, and have a resource that can execute as well as your internal resource? If not, start to look for those resources if you're in a shared resource situation. Also, review your estimated task durations with the assigned resources. There's nothing worse than a project manager that says, we need to get this done in 2 weeks. And then he goes to the people that have to do it, and they say, that's impossible. That's a 5-week project or a 5-week task. So get the best and worst case estimates from your resources. They'll tell you what they can achieve it in, and they can also tell you what could go wrong and what could happen. So you, of course, want to target the best case because you don't want to give them too much slack. But you need to plan for the worst case, too. And you should almost have 2 project plans. One is the optimum plan, and one is your worst case plan, because stuff happens. So let's spend a couple minutes talking about managing technical risk. So there are tactics for managing technical risk, and they include confirm that the new technology is truly a user need and a major sales point. Because you want to know that you're going to get the return on investment, because managing this technical risk is not easy, and it requires a lot more attention than if you're just putting V2 technology into a product. Make sure you identify the risks and benefits of the new technology in terms of product safety and performance. So does this new technology potentially introduce risks that weren't in an older product or might be new to that clinical environment? And if so, is the benefit of the new technology going to offset that risk such that your users look at it favorably? Find subject matter experts and pay for knowledge transfer. What I mean here is, if it's new technology to you and you didn't develop it and somebody else has been using that technology, go find a subject matter expert in that technology and pay them to give you the information that's going to stop you from making the same mistakes that they've made in the past. People hate paying consultants, or they hate paying other people for information that they think they can get themselves. But you can almost be assured that it's going to cost you more time and money to make the mistakes that they've already made than just to pay them to tell you what the mistakes are. When you're working with new technology, add more design reviews, more testing, and just make sure you do it over and over. Really kick the tires on that new technology. Be critical with it and test early and test often. And also take that new technology and test to failure. Find out when it completely doesn't work. Understand, is there a lot of variability in that new technology to where maybe you need a larger sample size because it's just not as predictable as you think. Don't just test it to meet requirements. Test it to understand how much safety factor you have between your requirements and the capabilities of that new technology. And remain skeptical. Sometimes you get good results and you were just lucky, and the next time you do it, it might not come out the same way. So how do you optimize your design verification? Well, you have to develop a strategy that gets you through verification. I can give you a little bit of a definition. So verification is demonstrating through objective evidence that the product design meets the manufacturer's specification. When you verify a product, it means you have made the product correctly. It meets your requirements. Different than validation. I'll cover that in a minute. However, verification should not be discovery or feasibility. Verifying means that you are demonstrating that it's already there. As I mentioned earlier, don't swing for the fence in verification. Your testing for verification shouldn't be the first time in the lab. You should be going in there confident that that product is going to pass that verification test. How do you do that? You test early, you test often, and then verification is really just verification. It's not discovery. We learn more from our failures than we do from success. So fail early, fail fast, and leave yourself in your schedule time to improve so that you're not at the last minute going, it doesn't work. Use standards to drive testing wherever possible. Do the research. There are standards for almost anything you want to test, but they might come from another industry. An example I ran into is we were trying to measure gloss on the surface finish of an orthopedic implant. And it was like, how can we do this? Well, we could use a profilometer, but that scratches the device. Well, we can use a laser interferometer. Well, that's $200,000. We don't have that. But you know what? The automotive industry has these handheld gloss meters that they use to look at the paint on a car right on the shop floor. Oh, well, it's a different industry. It's a different standard than medical, but it would give you a test method that you could use for some verification activities if appropriate. A little bit more about design verification. If you don't have the expertise in-house, go find some experts to help guide you on the selection of verification tests, especially those that might be required by regulatory agencies. So people are often surprised that there are tests that they may not have heard of, that they didn't do the research on. A lot of times your experts are involved in the creation of those standards or requirements in those countries, and they can provide you with that insight as to why that test is required and what the expectation is. Intertech provides similar service when people come to us for electrical safety testing. We help them understand what are all of the standards that would be applied to their device, either in part or in total, and we help give them the guidance on what to do or what to expect in terms of testing. So also use experts. If you don't have a statistician in-house, use an expert to determine the appropriate sample sizes, especially for verification testing, because the old rules of thumbs don't always work with the FDA. They got some very smart people there, and they sit down and they say, you know, you haven't demonstrated with statistical significance that your product meets your specifications. You need a larger sample size, or you need to do it in a different manner. And so get in touch with those statisticians and ask them, can I really make the claim I want to make if I pass my verification testing? Make sure all your regulatory requirements are defined and anticipated when performing verification and product cert tests. What I mean there is if you think you're going to go into 4 different countries and each country has a slightly different voltage requirement, make sure that you've got that all defined as you go in, and when you ask to have that testing performed, make sure that it's done at that one time. Because if you go in there and just say, okay, test me to the U.S. voltage requirements, and then you come back and say, I want to go to Korea, and we say, well, you're going to have to retest it, it costs a lot more money to go in the lab twice than once. And then ensure that your verification activities are aligned with your risk management files. Your risk management file really should be the source of the verification activities. Mitigation of risk is often achieved by evidence that you meet the specifications. And that's what the verification testing does. So make sure it's aligned. People fail with electrical testing often at the very start because they don't have a risk management file that identifies all the potential hazards that are actually in the electrical safety standards, in which case we have to send them back and they do the risk management file again. And the same can be said for almost any verification activity. Design validation. So I gave you the definition of verification, and validation is demonstrating through objective evidence that your product meets the user needs and the intended use of the device. When you validate the product, it means you have made the right product for that user need. So your validation should include demonstrating clinical safety and efficacy in a real-world setting. It could be simulated, but it's got to be representative of what goes on in the real world. You should demonstrate that the product usability has reduced any risks that are associated with use errors as low as possible. So that means doing your summative usability testing as part of your validation. And then you want to test actual production or production equivalent product in actual or simulated use environments. Too often we see people do some early evaluations in the clinical setting with a prototype, and then they try to bring that over and say, okay, well, this issue was all handled early, but the final product actually might have a different user interface which negates that earlier work. And so you really need to test your production or production equivalent products in that final evaluation. And validation also should include the assessment of packaging and labeling. So it's not just does the product work, does the instruction manual work? Does the product safely get to the client to where it's not damaged? And then you're going to include confirmation that user needs are met for the full product lifecycle. Like I said, user needs aren't just what the clinical user has, but what are the user needs for recycling the product at the end of its service life? And what about the packaging that goes with it into that country? What's got to be done with that packaging? So when you're doing design validation, one of the things you're trying to prove is clinical performance. The feasibility of clinical safety and efficacy shouldn't be determined in validation. Similar to verification, the validation activity should be that you're demonstrating that you have objective evidence that supports your product claims as opposed to discovering whether or not the product works as intended. Now, early in development, you can actually use the investigation device exemption, which you might need just to do your clinical evaluation. But you could use this earlier with an early stage protocol to perform early clinical evaluations and prove feasibility of the device in terms of safety and efficacy. Now, of course, it can't be a high-risk device if you're doing a little bit of early feasibility, but you might have to mitigate that through different things. The FDA does differentiate between significant risk devices and non-significant risk devices during your IDE, so you'll have to keep all that in mind. If you are doing early IDE work or throughout your clinical evaluation, you do want to do usability assessments. If you're doing it early, like your first time, an alpha prototype into a clinical evaluation under an IDE study, this could be your early formative testing where you're collecting information about the user interface. And then later on, when you go in for your final clinical testing to verify that the product meets all the requirements and the user needs, then that would be your summative testing. When actual validation work is undertaken as part of the clinical study, make sure that you clearly define the endpoints on the study. What is it that's going to prove that you meet the requirements and you meet the user needs and that the product is safe and effective? More than one company has been either too vague or too prescriptive in their endpoints, and they either ended up not making the requirements as maybe a 510K, or it pushed them because they demonstrated that they had more risk than anticipated into a PMA or an HDE device. So be real careful when you're doing your clinical evaluation to assure that you've got the endpoints defined and you're confident that you'll achieve them. A little bit more about design validation. So compliance with usability standards and the use of human factors engineering are means to demonstrate that use errors have been mitigated. Like verification, you don't want to wait until the validation step to apply these tools. You want to take a look at it early in development and throughout development. Integrate human factors engineering as early as possible and do testing as early as possible to determine whether or not you've got any issues with the device in terms of use errors that could lead to hazards and risk. And where you don't have that internal expertise, there are people out there that they live and breathe human factors engineering on a daily basis, and they do it over and over. In fact, some of these people sit on some of these standards committees and have great relationships with the FDA and the notified bodies because they're experts in the field. So lastly, let's talk about regulatory submissions. If you get all the way through verification and validation, you put your regulatory submission together and you make that submission and it's kicked back for being incomplete, or they ask you some really hard questions that cause you to not be able to answer them in a timely manner, that's going to put a delay on your program. So one of the keys with the FDA is understand that their guidance documents are almost mandatory requirements, and you should review those guidance documents, all that are applicable to your product, and understand what is going to be required in terms of what should be included in the submission. The FDA issues draft and final guidance documents with increasing regularity. The drafts will come out. You can review that, anticipate that there's going to be some changes, but when the final guidance is issued, you have to anticipate that they're going to start to enforce it almost immediately. Where you have questions about the FDA, use experts if you don't have that knowledge or skill inside your team. If your team only submits one regulatory submission every 2 years, go get an expert who does it on a regular basis, because the requirements and what's accepted within the FDA changes. And so what might have been good 3 years ago may not be up to snuff today. And as you know, FDAs can cost months and cost you thousands of dollars, not only in lost opportunities and lost sales, but if you are in a situation where you're unable to complete the information to the FDA that they've asked for, they basically reset the clock and you resubmit your 510K or your PMA, and you have to pay those fees again. Similar to what goes on in the U.S., the EU is a changing environment. The new medical device and IVD regulations have been published, and you're going to look at a lot of new requirements, and the rigor for the review of your technical dossier or your technical file is escalating. One other thing to keep in mind, there are going to be fewer notified bodies available to review those submissions. So the queue time is going to be much longer. That being said, it means you can't afford to get rejected and have to go back into that queue. You really need to do those regulatory submissions for the EU right the first time. So use experts where you don't have that skill. Make sure that they do a pre-submission review. Make sure they're up to speed on what's going on with the medical device regulation and understand it, and they can help you assure that you get that done right the first time for that submission. So in summary, late market launches and poor quality medical devices shouldn't be the status quo. The cost of a late launch or recall is going to be more than offset by the cost of doing it right the first time. So yes, it might add 3 months to the project plan to have all the resources at 70%. But if they have time to do it right the first time and make sure that they do the design reviews, the testing, and take away all that technical risk, it's going to be more than offset compared to if you rush to market, you're 3 months early, but then you have to do a recall, which costs you probably the equivalent of a year's worth of sales. So we'll open it up to questions and see if anybody has any that we can answer.
Okay, very good. Michael, you've given the audience an awful lot to think about. You've got a small book here. It's like drinking from the fire hose. But some questions are coming in. And ladies and gentlemen, this is your chance now. So you've got a chance to ask a really smart guy questions. So pick on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type the questions in there. We have a few already. Michael, how's this one? How can I anticipate changes in regulatory requirements for my major markets?
So almost all of the major markets have websites that really talk about what the regulatory requirements are, but in many cases they also talk about what activities are going on within that market. The EU is very good about publishing minutes and things about what's going on in the market. There are also different organizations that provide information. So you have the Regulatory Affairs Professionals Society, RAPS, and they have newsletters and other things that will help you stay abreast. And you have to spend the time doing the research and understanding what markets you need to be in, and then address those. Of course, there are people that do this for a living and provide those answers and that guidance, and that's always another way to do it, is hire a consultant that can give you that information.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Well, here's another one that came in. I have a relatively young development team, the newbies you talked about, but they have a great technical skills. How can I ensure that the products they design are safe?
So a few things. If you have a young team, let's say you're a startup organization, all a bunch of young, ambitious people, first off, make sure you're using risk management tools. They didn't implement ISO 14971 to make it as an add-on at the end of the process. It really is a tool to assure that not only do you mitigate risks, but you could actually end up with a more innovative product that's easier to sell and a safer product. That being said, when you don't have those people or haven't applied that, bring in subject matter experts or expertise where you can get it to help you do design reviews. Design reviews are called out in ISO 13485, which is your quality management system for medical devices, and it's a key activity. There are standards on how to do design reviews, but it's something that should be done with people independent of the organization so that they can have an objective viewpoint and not worry about where are they going to get their next paycheck.
Okay, very good. All right, Phil has a question here. How can you streamline upfront feasibility and conceptual work prior to design controls to reduce lead times and costs? You got that?
Yep. So that upfront, before you make the decision to commercialize a product, once again, we'll take a step back and say that you can do a lot of work up front. It's only when you say that I'm going to start to commercialize this product that design controls should apply. You need to define that in your quality management system. And so you can have what some people call a discovery phase or a concept development phase, where it's really iterative with acquiring the user needs, and you're going out and you're doing research to say, okay, what can I do? How can I evaluate it? So there are a lot of ways to do that. You can take, there are people out there that do the human factors experts that can help you sit there and build just conceptual prototypes. They don't work, they don't do anything, but maybe you go through a evaluation with a potential user and they tell you what's going to work or not work. Some of your industrial design firms also can give you different concepts because they have human factors experts on staff. They can look at what's been done before, other design studies, and a lot of that can be done early as a conceptual tool while you're generating your user needs.
Okay, excellent. Hey, I want to ask a question now. On slide 20, you mentioned human factors and usability experience. They sound pretty much alike to me. How do they differ? Human factors engineering versus usability experience.
Well, so they are, so human factors engineering is kind of like mechanical engineering. It's a set of tools and skills that is engineering based on how do you verify ergonomics, usability, many different aspects to it. So if you think of it, human factors engineering is the big bucket, and usability is a smaller subset within human factors that typically deals with if there's a chance that a product will create a hazard and then a risk, and it's due to a use error, has your quote-unquote usability of the device mitigated the potential for that use error?
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Okay, one more question here then. Can I combine usability testing with clinical trials?
Yeah, as I mentioned on a couple of the slides, if you're in early development, you're going to do kind of an alpha prototype assessment. And let's say you decide I'm going to do an investigational device exemption submission to the FDA because it's a significant risk device, and you set yourself up with an early protocol to get some clinical feedback on it. That is the best time to evaluate and perform formative testing of the product in terms of usability. And then when you finally finalize your design, you make your production equivalent or production prototypes, and then you go into the market and you do your clinical evaluation. That's when you would do your summative testing.
Okay, very good. Okay, we seem to have answered all the questions, and we've gone past our hour allotment. So there's Mike's phone number and email was on the screen just a second ago. But ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our presentation, and we've answered all your questions. And once again, the webcast will be available for reviewing at medicaldesignandoutsourcing.com and the URL that you used today. One final message, you can follow Medical Design and Outsourcing on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So this concludes our program. I want to thank Mike Lynch for the fine presentation and you in the audience for your attention and the good questions. So from here, from the staff at Medical Design and Outsourcing and Intertech, we wish you all a good and productive afternoon.